Love and death, probably the greatest themes in literature, in philosophy, in every form of discourse on ultimate concern. To discuss these realities, love and death, I have with me Professor Philip Goodchild. Philip, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Why is love, why as human beings are we so interested in these two topics?
It's amazing why there is such an interest. I would say that nearly every narrative in our Western tradition, every fictional narrative, every film, every soap opera touches regularly on the two themes of love and death and their relationship. And there seems to be a fascination with both, but in a way whereby they're often connected, insofar as someone might demonstrate their love by being willing to risk their life.
Yeah, because of course deep within the Western, or at least the Christian psyche, is the figure of Jesus. You know, greater love hath no man than to lay down your life for his friend. And so we link the death of Jesus and love. And I often wonder, do we often end up with a situation whereby death becomes the sort of shadow side of love, and love seems to be only provable or only valuable if it involves suffering, and we end up in this notion of tragedy.
This is, yes, quite strange, because if the aim of life were to be considered that we should all love each other, you know, John Lennon, love is all you need, and we show that love by sacrificing ourselves, sacrificing our lives for others, then what is it that we expect others to obtain by our sacrifice? Does their life then give them the chance to sacrifice for still others? And do you have an endless chain of sacrifices? In which case, what does it fall for? Why does it matter? And another aspect of it is, if we think of death or suffering as somehow essential to love, then by affirming love and saying love is the most important thing that we have or we need, aren't we also saying implicitly we require death and suffering, we affirm death and suffering as an occasion for showing or demonstrating love? So in the end, it starts to look like a somewhat negative view of life, insofar as life has to be constructed around love and self-sacrifice.
And of course, there have been periods in Western culture, I'm thinking in the aftermath of the Black Death, when remembering death, the Memento mori, takes on such a focus that it actually perverts the whole vision of creation. Creation seems to be almost built in such a way that it must suffer and it must involve pain.
Mm.
And at the time, of course, theologians are always brilliant at finding rationality within their tradition to explain how they're feeling. And having got this sense that life, life is miserable, they then explain, oh well, that must mean that we are a sin-soaked humanity, and you end up actually with with another absurdity, that almost if it is all so dark and so bad, and we must remember death, then why bother with life at all? Why don't we just treat life as an interruption before we get on to the main business, which is death?
Yes, that's a real question. I think we needn't see death entirely in dark terms, though, or not at least the thought of death. Thinking more existentially, if one considers, suppose I might die tomorrow, it might be a depressing thought at first, but what it awakens for me is the question, right, what am I going to do in the intervening time? Is what I'm planning to do, what I'm thinking of doing, what I habitually do, really worth it? And life is finite anyway, so perhaps we should be posing this question to ourselves. Is what we're doing really worth it? Is it what we really desire to do? Or is it just some kind of trivial distraction from the main business? So in regard to the future, I think remembering death has an awakening power, and it doesn't necessarily change anything. It just reminds one of what within one counts as most worthwhile, or makes one remember the people who are most important.
Yes, well, what's that old line? Nothing focuses the mind like the thought that one is going to be executed in the morning.
Yes.
That one. But isn't there this phrase that's used by Heidegger, being towards death?
Yes.
I actually don't. There's something about the phrase of being towards death that I find very repulsive. I think of being as a good thing. I think of being as, maybe this is from my own theological vision, is that being leads towards enhancement. It leads towards harvest, reaping. I'm very taken by the whole pseudogenes idea that being comes, you take hold of being, it's somehow enriched, and then it goes back. It comes out from God and then it returns to God. But being towards death does seem to also capture another aspect, an aspect that I'm not as happy with to think about, but it is an aspect of human life, that everything we do is going towards this finality.
Yes, it's a phrase that I find somewhat ambivalent. Heidegger is apparently focused on death. If he thinks this is where we find our real authentic existence is in our orientation towards death, and we can ignore it most of the time and just think one will die one day, but or think others die, but don't really appropriate that it will happen to oneself. So what he's aiming for is a kind of awakening to one's own most possibility. And he says a number of interesting things about this being towards death. That obviously only I can die my death. No one else can die for me. They might die in my place, but I will die myself eventually. But even then, when I do die, I won't experience my death because I'll be dying or dead. So death in itself isn't an object of an experience. And when someone else dies, I experience them ceasing to communicate with me, but I don't experience their encounter with death. So death isn't something that we experience. And then that makes me wonder, well, in this notion of being towards death, aren't we simply imagining something? And Heidegger says being towards death is the possibility of the impossibility of existence, which is a bit of a mouthful, but clearly it means we're just imagining when one can't exist anymore. So I find it ambivalent. On the one hand, it's a kind of awakening thought that makes one take stock of one's life and think, what is really worthwhile? What is it that I really love? On the other hand, it's still imagining reality rather than being in and with reality.
Well, there's another aspect towards this reality of being towards death and being aware of the finality, is that we become conscious that one of the great illusions is that I'm going to live forever.
Mm.
And it's somewhat frightening to think, how we do things, almost as if we know that death happens, but just maybe I might escape. And I think one of the illusions that we have to cope with is that we don't, you know, there is the joke of the person who's in their 80s and they're wondering about how long is the guarantee on a piece of kitchenware, you know, and the answer comes back, well, it'll last you a lifetime, meaning no matter how short that is. But equally, there is a lot of things we do in life. We aim and work hard as if we're going to get ever more onto new plateau, and we're going to live forever, and coping with that illusion, and at the same time still meaningfully engaging, I find to be one of the tensions in a reflective life.
It certainly is. Insofar as we are animals and live an animal kind of existence, we can live for the present moment. We can live in a kind of immediacy, and some people think that's a healthy thing to do. But insofar as we live by our projects that work towards the common good or the greater good, or insofar as we put aside our immediate desires in order to attain better, more longer distance goals, then we have to live for the future. And this is the way in which we are conditioned to live in our culture, is to live very much for the future. We engage in planned projects all the time. We're continually monitoring them as well. And the thing about death is it reminds us that we're finite. It reminds us that all these plans will eventually run out. And even if we think of our plans in terms of what will endure beyond our lifetimes, whether it's our children or whether it's the books we write, I'm quite well aware that the time will come at some point after my death. It might be one day, it might be 10 years, it might be 100 years, but the time will come when no one reads anything that I've written anymore. So anything that I do in my life will not endure for very long beyond me. And it's a similar thing with having children. Of course, they might have further children. I have 2 daughters. But my genetic line, and similarly the influence that I have had upon their personalities, will be diluted with every pairing, with every generation, and halved in its significance. So broadly, not only is my life finite, but my influence is finite as well.
So this is the Ozymandias vision. Look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair. And yet the poet is actually looking at ruins in the desert and silence all around.
Exactly.
This curious link, you know, it's at the heart of all tragedy, between love and death. Why is love so important to humanity?
I don't think I'm in a position to answer that. I think it just is. I think it's perhaps a cultural thing that we emphasize the significance and importance of love, but it's also an experiential thing, and it's also a biological thing. It's deeply ingrained within us that we should enjoy the company of others and enjoy as much proximity as we are capable of.
So you're taking the position that built into our humanity is this need for companionship, this need for existing in community and in society, and that is just as much a given as that we need air and oxygen.
I think so. Some philosophers have said that we have a desire to continue in existence, to preserve ourselves, and this is a kind of biological or natural given. I suppose I would tend to think that we have a desire to love, and that's almost a natural given. Of course, I can tell that in some cultures that is emphasized more than others, but it seems to me that the highest joys in life, even if it's not love of another person, if it's love of an ideal or love of a practice, this can also be important, or love of art, but this is where we gain our satisfaction in life.
You quoted earlier, John Lennon, "All you need is love." In a curious way, though, you're actually adopting, you're actually coming around to a very similar position yourself.
Well, when I think about love and death, I'm trying to think within a culture that values them both and values them together, and I want to know what is the implicit link. The broader question of could it be an illusion to think that love is so important? Is this just culturally specific? That doesn't interest me so much, because I'm thrown into and within this culture, and that's where I want to think.
So you're not identifying love with the selfish gene?
No.
Let's take that notion of the selfish gene. You say you're not taking it. How do you say that love is not just the illusion, so that is love anything more than just the nice frilliness that we put around selfishness? And if so, how would one get an insight into that?
I think love might often be taken to be a kind of selfishness. Obviously, you can have selfish genes together. You can have selfish individuals cooperating in their collective interest. And that then raises a question about, is this what love really is? Is love essentially a kind of mutuality, mutual benefits, mutual reciprocity? Well, in that case, love would be a means, and the benefits would be the end, whether you have greater security or greater economic well-being or whatever it is. That would be seen as the end, or even if it's just a longer life. Love, insofar as it's connected with death, is thought of apart from these worldly benefits of a longer life, greater economic security, greater health and well-being. So in this sense, love goes beyond mutuality and reciprocity. And the condition that we experience in life is that we become capable of loving in different ways and more effectively and more actively during adult life. But in childhood and in old age, and possibly at other times in between, we might not be so capable of that love. And this means that we gain benefits from the love of others that we don't entirely reciprocate at the same time, or to the same people, or in the same kind of way. So yes, we might gain benefits from the love of others, but we have to give even without receiving the benefits at the times when we're capable of doing so, in order that there can be a common good. But I want to go a bit further than that and suggest that if love is connected with death, then it's more than a kind of unreciprocal distribution, the distribution of our time and care and attention, love becomes an end in itself. And this is why I was saying that perhaps it's naturally within us, the drive or urge to love. It's another way of saying that is to view it as an end in itself. And so if we want to think, well, is our love a kind of group selfishness or paired selfishness? Or is our love an end in itself? Then to tell the difference, if we're going to be a little bit suspicious and suspect ourselves, to tell the difference, we'd have to ask, would my love still be there if I were to die tomorrow? So going back to the question, what difference does it make to my life to think I might die tomorrow? It tells me I should consider what is worthwhile. It also tells me to look back on what I've done in the past and think about how I've spent my time and think about, have I spent my time on what I feel is most important? And this, of course, is a recipe for a divided self. If you face up to yourself and think, have I lived up to my ideals? Have I lived up to what I really love? Then you're bound to be disappointed with yourself in some respects. And so that produces a certain kind of division within the self. You might be anxious about the future, whether you can live up to yourself. You might be guilty about the past, whether you have lived up to your loves. And in an important way, finitude also brings another division, because insofar as we do have within us some degree of an instinct for self-preservation, then knowing that one might die tomorrow makes one conscious that one can't act on and live out that impulse anymore. But of course, if it's natural within us, one has to resist death, one has to deny death, one has to try to live on, if at all possible, and yet one cannot. And so here, that at a really deep level, and at a level that's not really possible to resist or to renounce, there is this further state of division between an animal self that wants to continue living and a conscious self that might want to live, might want to die, might want to resign itself, but cannot possibly take hold of its animal self. They can kill it, but you cannot possibly take hold of your natural animal self and tell yourself, don't desire to live anymore.
And of course, the very act of thinking about these things, here we are in Nottingham in the early 21st century, and yet the very issues we're talking about can be found in ancient Egyptian texts, the dialogue of a man with his soul. It's the debate of Carneades when he arrives in Rome 2,000 years ago. The very act of this reflection deepens our own appreciation of our humanity.
Absolutely. And I've been thinking about humanity in terms of what it is to love, what it is to be loving beings. And one of the things that Aquinas said about the nature of love is it's twofold. There's two dimensions to it. On the one hand, you love what is good, and God is good, so you love God. On the other hand, as well as wanting what is good for your beloved, you also desire union with your beloved. And it's quite straightforward to think, well, I want the good for someone, God wants the good for someone, they want the good for themselves. We're all in agreement. It's very easy to be united around the good if only we knew what the good is. It's easy to be united around God if only we knew God in God's nature fully and ultimately. But that lack of knowledge leads to a problem, and it leads to a problem with being united with another. Insofar as we live in time, and that is as mortal beings, as beings that are going to die, as beings with a finite life, we're kind of cut off from this vision of what the good would really be. And so, insofar as we're going to unite with another person, that would mean being present alongside them. It would mean disclosing ourselves, disclosing our heart's desire to them. It would also mean coming to some kind of agreement with them about how best to live together, how best to be united. And it also involves this element of trust. And this is the sticky point, because we might like to trust each other. We might like to trust ourselves, but we don't know how we will behave and how others will behave in a crisis. So when we're presented with suffering or the prospect of death or some moment of crisis, then that's the time when trust has to prove itself. What is it that makes someone trustworthy? Well, this is where I would connect the idea of love and death. If I don't particularly like the idea of sacrifice, and because that leads to an infinite regression of everyone sacrificing for everyone else and who's meant to be enjoying the benefits of life, well, I think there's a different role for facing up to death and feeling that sense of division, that sense of guilt or anxiety or impotence. And if in full consciousness of that, one prioritizes one's heart's desire, then one becomes predictable and trustworthy. So there are all sorts of obstacles that hold people apart. Do people really desire the same thing? Can they really be trusted about what's in their heart? And facing up to death existentially seems to me to involve exactly the same as facing up to love existentially, because love is to some extent unknown. We might have desires for worldly pleasures, we might enjoy being close to others, but what is it within us that can continue to give to others, even in the limit cases, even when the benefits are on the other side? For that we need trustworthiness, and for that we need to have been proven ourselves through a certain kind of ordeal, and we need to prove ourselves to others. And that is why I would connect the thoughts of love and death.
Philip, there's no end to this conversation, but we've come round now in a nice circle to where we started. And so thank you for coming and sharing with me your thoughts on love and death. And I hope that this conversation is the beginning of other conversations, because as I think we both are in complete agreement, reflecting on love and death brings us to the very heart of the matter. Thanks, Philip.